Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're visiting with Revel author Laura Taggart, author of the newly released book, Making Love Last, Divorce-Proofing Your Young Marriage. Laura, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Eric.
We're delighted to have you. You've been a licensed marriage and family therapist for nearly 30 years, as Director of Marriage and Family Ministry at Community Presbyterian Church in Danville, California. You founded a highly successful marriage mentoring ministry to help young couples develop a solid foundation for their young and often struggling marriages. You're a popular speaker at conferences and retreats, and you taught as an adjunct professor at Fuller Theological, and I read something about Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Yes. I'll tell you something about it. Well, my husband and I have been teaching at the Evangelical Theological College there since 2004, and we teach a course on marriage and family issues, and it has been just quite a life-changing experience for us. We go every 2 years to do that course. You know,
my connection with Addis Ababa is through the Falashimora, the Ethiopian Jews that accepted Jesus, that were not airlifted out during Project Solomon, and were left behind because of their faith in Jesus. So there's a certain amount of ethnic and religious persecution going on with the Falashimora of Addis Ababa, and several ministries that we've worked with in the past bring water wells into those communities because they're untouchables. The Christian community doesn't want them, the Jewish community doesn't want them, and so they're kind of in this limbo state, and several of these ministries are doing medical outreaches there as well. What brought you to this particular aspect of marriage and family counseling?
The aspect of working with young people or young couples?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just have had a passion for young couples for a long time, and when I was Director of Marriage and Family Ministry at the church, I sat with a lot of young couples that were really struggling to figure out how to do marriage. They were surprised by the level of conflict they had early on, and they didn't have role models oftentimes, and they just needed a solid foundation. And so I trained older couples who had seasoned marriages and who had a lot of experience, and a lot of them had had struggles and gotten to the other side of those and had a wealth of information to share. Trained them to come alongside these young couples and just love on them, be with them, pray for them, spend time with them, help them overcome their very practical struggles that they were having. And in that context, I really got to know a lot of young couples and the issues that they were facing. Plus, I've been a marriage and family therapist for 30 years, so I've sat with a lot of young couples who have just been struggling. They have these expectations, often very idealized about marriage, and they get into marriage, and when things turn south or the differences begin to surface and the conflict really hits, they really oftentimes don't know what to do and come to some conclusions that, gee, it should be easier than this, maybe I've married the wrong person. And so oftentimes, and I think that accounts for the 32% divorce rate in this demographic of married 5 to 10 years, because they really don't realize what hard work marriage is.
In your young marriage, thinking back to the early years of your marriage, what was that like for you? And is some of this working through memories and conflicts that you had that you're able to take and draw on that practical experience and be able to apply how you were able to work your way through it?
Absolutely. My husband and I got married at 20 and 21. We were very young. We were very idealistic about the way marriage would be. We dated for 5 years and had a wonderful relationship. And we thought it was going to be, pretty easy. We thought we were going to kind of have a model marriage, quite honestly. And then we got into it and realized, at the beginning of marriage, you accommodate each other and you have this dream about how it's going to be. And so you sort of, the differences are submerged in the relationship, and you try to avoid conflict, and you just want to defer conflict and differences such that you can be getting along and make the dream work. Well, invariably, after a while, your identities reemerge, your personalities emerge, and you begin to express differences, and those differences often for these young couples are really scary. So they try to manipulate or kind of squeeze the other back into the mold they were hoping for. And when they start that squeezing, it causes a lot of offense and a lot of conflict, and then things escalate. And so for me personally, that's exactly what happened. We had these expectations, and I had expectations of who my husband would be, and I would communicate those expectations often with disappointment and criticism. And of course, he didn't like that very much, and so he would react and he would distance and withdraw. And so we set up early on in marriage, probably by year 4 or 5, this experience of conflict and me pursuing him, him avoiding me, and it just became pretty uncomfortable.
And where did you find help?
Well, I think what helped, Eric, is really maturing and time and being able to challenge the notion that we should not have conflict. I think we began to embrace the differences of each other differently. We began to see them not as something scary that should be pushed away, but something actually that could enrich the relationship. And we learned how to talk about our differences differently. Rather than throwing heated comments, we learned how to express ourselves directly, clearly, but we also weren't doing it aggressively. And I think that made a big difference for us when we began to settle down, calm ourselves, and begin to have a different kind of discussion about the issues and differences that we have.
How realistic is it that someone would know somebody well enough when they're dating them that they would be able to recognize in them narcissistic tendencies or control tendencies, or the things that I heard so much about in my counseling ministry that there was no indication?
Yes, well, they are hard to detect for a couple of reasons. One is that if someone really has some kind of personality disorder like narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder, they can be very, very charming, and they can hide it under a cloak of being very congenial and accommodating, and so during that brief period of courtship, they can pull off almost anything, which is somewhat scary, I realize. But if you're alert, you can begin to notice. But oftentimes, what happens is the chemistry of early relationship, that infatuation, causes, and actually chemically, research has shown it actually does something in the brain to kind of take you offline, so that you're not really noticing those imperfections and the controlling behavior. You've gotten this chemistry going, and it almost makes you blind to some of the true characterological things that might be going on in the potential partner.
Is there any way to look at the parents of your future spouse and get a feel for what the influences, look at the dynamic of the in-laws to see what the patterns of behavior, the influences would be, and whether or not they had a healthy role model, or they were trying to get away from what it was, but they still carry it with them?
Oh, definitely. I think that's really a good point, Eric, because our families of origin are really very shaping for us. And if you look at a mother and father of your prospective spouse, how they treat each other, whether they treat each other respectfully, how they treat the children, if there's a lot of liaisons and favorites and unhealthy behavior between parent and children, you can pick up on that. Also, I think how your spouse relates to their parents. Is there some respect? Is there a good deal of love? Is there or is there also enmeshment? Is there an overly close relationship between like a mother and a son, or between a family? And so that can be a challenge as well if there's an over-controlling parent. That usually you can pick up on if you spend enough time in the home of your spouse to notice those kinds of behaviors. So yes, I think, and it's one thing, you don't want to be just hyper alert to every imperfection, because the reality is we all stumble in many ways and we all have something to work through from childhood. But you can pick up on some, grossly unhealthy behavior if you are in the home.
Yeah, one of the examples that you gave in the book was of a young couple, and she was kind of a neat freak, and she kind of had everything together, and he was exhausted and he would just toss his stuff. I can't imagine this idea that, and it's usually men, that would take off their clothes and leave them on the floor.
Oh, this happens all the time. You always have, discrepancies in a couple between neatness and what is often called just a more relaxing attitude. The other person might call it being slovenly and sloppy, but the person who is liking to do that just says, I just want to be more relaxed. I don't want to be so uptight. I come home, I'm stressed. I want to be able to put my things wherever. And so this is a very common difference between husband and wife, as are sexual differences. Those are pretty standard fare for a husband and wife to have differences sexually. And emotionally, different ways of processing emotion or even identifying emotion if they're capable of that. So there's just so many ways in which we are so very different that I think if we have the perspective that we're not going to be different, we really set ourselves up.
You give so many examples in the book and so many very helpful exercises at the end of the book. As you played this out in developing your practice, your ministry, watching successes, watching dynamics, did you find that men become very defensive, almost to the point of blocking, of cutting off, of withdrawing the moment that they hear something that it comes off as knocking them off their horse?
Yeah, I think every man that I know of, every husband I've ever worked with, wants to be enough for his wife. He wants to satisfy her. He wants to make her happy. And when she's unhappy, it cuts him to the quick, and it's painful for him. He doesn't know what to often do with that. And, it is stereotypical, but I think it's often true that women have more of an ability to process emotion, express emotion, and men find oftentimes that they feel that they can't meet the need of the wife, and so they pull away or withdraw or shut down. They have a sense that she is, or experience that she is more verbal about her emotions, and he doesn't have that kind of equipment oftentimes, not always, of course, but oftentimes. So he, rather than engage and learn, he tends to pull away and shut down and avoid. And so, there is some truth to that. I think husbands who have the courage to jump in and just start learning how to be there for her, it's valuable. But for women too, they have a way sometimes of expressing their disappointment and disillusionment with a lot of criticism, and that just makes a husband want to run and hide. So, she needs to learn how to be able to express her legitimate feelings and thoughts in a way that is not critical, but rather a complaint and a positive request for change that can be more hopeful, and also add a little affirmation in there.
We seem to do a better job of encouraging our children and speaking life into them than we do to each other.
Yeah,
and
so
we men tend to be nurturers when it comes to their children, but not to their wives. They're providers for their wives and nurturers for their children. And the wife is relational in all aspects, but when it comes to the dynamic between a young husband or any age husband and his wife, he's the provider. That's his expression of love, and it's almost universal that they define themselves by what they do, not by who they are. You always ask a man what he does, and you've learned not to ask a woman, because if she's a homemaker, how do you respond? There's always the wrong response to, well, I'm a stay-at-home mom. And all of a sudden you're ill-prepared to respond to her in an edifying way. So, oh, that must be great for you guys. And then you walk away. But for a man, he engages on what he does, because that is his definition of provision.
Yes, I think that's true overall. I think for millennials, that actually is a little less true. I think millennial young men are getting much more engaged in child care and nurture. They're much more interested in connection with their wives. They define themselves less by their work and more by their lifestyle. And so I think that's a little different for millennials today. But I think overall, of course, even young millennials who are married, they want to be good providers. The guys, the men, they want to be good providers for their wives, of course. And so I think that is, and oftentimes they think that should be enough. And it really isn't enough. The wife longs for more emotional connection and nurture. And so part of the growth, I think, of marriage, and I think that is really the dynamic of marriage, is that God designed it to grow us and to transform us. And so what my spouse needs most from me is often the hardest thing for me to give. But as I learn to give it, I become more mature. I become more loving. And vice versa. The thing that I need most from him is often the hardest thing for him to give me. But as he learns to give it, he grows and matures. And so I think there's a very important created dynamic of marriage.
The picture that I have in my mind is that a husband's responsible for shepherding his wife's heart. And as I counseled, I used to have a tennis ball, and when I would start with a new couple, I would throw the tennis ball to the prospective groom or the young groom and tell him that for the next hour, he cannot put it down. He can't drop it. He can't put it on a shelf. He has to understand that the job of shepherding a heart is a full-time job. And he still has to have a free hand because I'm getting him to open the Bible. And he has to be able to figure out how he cannot drop, put on a shelf, depart from, leave behind this heart that he's responsible for shepherding.
Oh, yeah. One of the beautiful images I love, Eric, about male-female relationships kind of comes out of Ephesians 5. And it talks about, well, the image I have is of a beautiful pair ice skating. The man and the woman as they're ice skating in pairs. What he brings to the relationship, if they're going to have a beautiful performance, he brings the strength. He undergirds her. He throws her, but he brings his strength in, and his whole role in that dance, in that ice skating performance, is to show off her beauty and her grace. And that's his role. And in Ephesians it says his role, husband's role, is to evoke her beauty. And that is what his role is. His role is to undergird her, support her. It says 3 times, love your wives as Christ loved the church, sacrificially love her, and as you say, shepherd her heart. And then the wife's role in that beautiful ice skating dance is to lean into his strength. It's to trust him that he is bringing his good strength to the relationship. And if he either drops, or if he's not the strength in the relationship and she doesn't lean in and trust him, they're both going to end up on the ice, and it's going to be pretty painful.
Right.
And I love that picture that I think comes out of Ephesians 5, for her to respect him and lean into him and trust him and know that he's doing his best and he has good intention, as opposed to always be critical and disillusioned. I think that passage is a challenge to what is, I think, the most profound difficulty for both. And for men, I think it's selfishness and not keeping his wife on his radar. And for her, it's disillusionment and disappointment, which causes her to be disrespectful. So therein lies the challenge for both. Husbands are called to love, wives are called to respect, because they both struggle, I think, more with the selfishness and the disappointment.
Every man wants a Proverbs 31 wife, but he doesn't understand what a Proverbs 31 man is.
Yeah.
And when you look that she is elevated to a stature in the city, that means that her husband has lifted her up and paved the way for her to be respected in the community. And that requires a great deal of security on his part, that if she rises to a level of success which is greater than his own level of success, that there cannot be jealousy. There has to be a sense of great value placed to that.
Oh, so true. I think that's one of the things I love about my husband the most, is he's so affirming and encouraging of anything that I want to try or do. And that has just made him very endearing to me. So rather than feeling threatened by anything I do, he's been totally on board. In the book, I talk about nurturing shared interests, and I was into cycling during a period of time, and I would go out with a group of women, and he really missed me on those Saturday mornings. And so rather than tell me, I don't like you doing that, or you can't do that, or whatever, some men might say, he decided he was going to become the videographer for the group and come out every Saturday morning and video all of us as we went by, and then create videos to give us at the end of the year party. So that was just, he endeared himself to me, and he endeared himself to the entire group of 60 women by just jumping in and being a part of it with me.
Well, I think that's a beautiful testimony. We're talking with Laura Taggart, author of the newly released book, Making Love Last, Divorce-Proofing Your Young Marriage and Divorce-Proofing Your Old Marriage. This applies to if you're still struggling in this marriage and you've been married 25 years and the blush has fallen off the rose and you're settled into very bad habits and to a dynamic that causes you to become an avoider, an escaper, and longing for a better life in your marriage. This is certainly a book for you. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to dig into more of the text here of Making Love Last, Divorce-Proofing Your Young Marriage. While we're on break, visit ignitingnation.com, click on Books and Media, and order a copy for yourself and for your millennial child or your millennial grandchild. This is an incredible gift that you can give them to start out their life on the right foot, as opposed to watching them head into troubled waters. We'll be right back. Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our 1-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource, and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Laura Taggart, author of the newly released book from our good friends at Revell, a Baker publishing group company, Making Love Last, Divorce-Proofing Your Young Marriage. Laura, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Eric.
Laura, you talk about, in the book, you have a chapter dedicated to why marriage is worth it.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of people that think that maybe it's not worth it, but biblically, God makes a very strong case for marriage, doesn't he?
He does. Yeah. So, yeah, marriage, a lot of times, even though we're in the heat of battle or we're experiencing difficult times, marriage can be, and I believe by design was intended to be, the most transformational relationship of our life, because in that most intimate relationship, we do have the opportunity to either wound the other or be a place of healing and intimacy with one another. And I think that intimate connection, being known by another deeply and being loved by them, warts and all, and vice versa, is an absolutely healing and transforming experience. And being able to be that vulnerable and that safe with another human being and experiencing that kind of grace and space to grow can make a major, major difference in our life. And I think marriage can become that, but first it's hard. And if you realize that and hold on when the times are tough, you may experience, and hopefully will experience, that other side. I think about, and I wrote in the book in that chapter, that marriage is like we are all a castle individually. We're a castle with an old moat around it. If you remember the castles in Europe, with the water around it. And so we have this sort of protective moat around us, and we get to choose whether we let down our bridge over that moat and invite the other in. And if we feel like the other is an intruder or going to harm us, we're not going to let them in. But if we feel like they are safe, we can let the bridge down. And once that other comes inside our castle, they can experience the castle, and they can also see some of the vulnerabilities of that castle. And if they treat those vulnerabilities lovingly and confidentially and respectfully, we allow them to stay longer and longer. And that's what intimacy is. It's learning how to be safe for our mate in such a way that they can be fully themselves in our presence. And if there is harm or violation, oftentimes we draw up our bridge, we close the gate, and we don't let them in. And so many marriages I see have created this kind of closure where they don't allow their mate into their intimate thoughts and feelings. But marriage is that opportunity. This is the most intimate relationship we'll ever experience. And if we can learn how to be safe ourselves and also be able to extend that safety to our mate, we have the opportunity for a lot of growth. And I do tell couples, marriage has stages. And the first stage is that very romantic stage, which is necessary for the relationship. But it's also an illusion. It's built on a dream of the way things should be, but not necessarily the reality of the way things truly are. And then there's that second stage of disillusionment where you realize you're married to a real person with real imperfections, and you're going to have to figure this out. And then the third stage is rediscovery, where you begin to move into a new awareness of the identity of your mate, a new ability to handle the differences and actually welcome them, a new way of communicating, with each other in a more respectful, loving way. And once you get there, the bridge on your castle can be down quite a bit more. But that season between the disillusionment and the rediscovery, it can be, that transition has to do a lot with having recalibrated your expectations about marriage and begin to accept the differences and take responsibility for communicating yourself in a way that isn't attacking, isn't blaming, but assumes responsibility for your part and is willing to listen to the other. So marriage is worth it, I think, because it's transformational and it is the most intimate relationship of our life. And if we can learn how to do it well, it has the power to make us different people and transform us into who God intended us to be originally, and to heal a lot of those wounds as well.
By design.
By design.
By design.
Yeah.
You know, as you're talking, I'm seeing a piece of sandpaper hitting a piece of wood, and I'm sure it's very uncomfortable for the wood. But if the wood kept pulling away, it would never become refined. And
Yes.
the sandpaper would never turn into a polishing cloth. So the longer it remains in contact,
Yeah.
the more
Yeah.
it wears down the high places and the more the sandpaper becomes a polishing cloth. And all of a sudden you then take great pride in this beautiful luster and this polish and this shine, because you see the reflection of both God and your spouse in there.
I love that picture. Yeah, so true. Yeah, and I believe God uses our marriage to refine us. I don't think there's any relationship of our life that is so, because, you know, if you lived on a desert island by yourself, you could live under the illusion that you were a kind and forgiving and person. But it's when you're face to face with the reality of another human being where you have to sacrifice, you have to compromise, you have to look at yourself differently. That relationship is like a mirror in your face every day, and that can change you in a very positive way. So,
how much of a reflection is conflict in a marriage with our expectations to God?
Can you say that one more time? And
as we look at young marriages, do we also
Yeah.
see in this conflict with each other that there's also a certain, excuse me, a certain amount of lack of maturity in their walk with the Lord, and it's this idea that the two, a man will leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife and they'll become one.
Yeah.
Do they really understand this compound unity, that one becomes a much stronger number when it's two united as one, but when you have that cord of three strands and it's still one, it's one cord, but it's made of three strands, that we understand this triune nature of God, this compound unity of God, and how it's to be reflected in our marriages? Do we see that some of the tensions, some of the difficulties are also in their depth of understanding about the relationship vertically that's reflected in the horizontal?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I think a lot of times they enter marriage understanding that they are going to become one, but when they get into marriage, they say, which one? They want their own way, and we're confronted with our selfishness in the intimate relationship of marriage. And what happens is, rather than trusting God that He has their best interest at heart in this mate that He has provided for them, they begin to fight those differences, and they begin to want to make for their own happiness. And they have a belief that marriage is about happiness. Now, hopefully marriage does make us happy, but it may not. First, it may make us miserable before it makes us happy. And that misery is about being able to confront things in ourselves and learn how to be a loving listener and learning how to communicate healthily and maturely. So I think in early marriage, oftentimes they have the idea that, yes, we'll become one, but there's also that selfishness that is not quite weeded out yet. And it never is ultimately completely weeded out. I mean, we all experience selfishness on a daily basis, but I think in early marriage, oftentimes because of that idealism, they have a picture of how it should be. And often that picture has to do with winning an argument or being right or wanting the mate to move toward them in a certain way in which they're not. And rather than looking to God to meet their ultimate needs, they start to look to the spouse to meet their ultimate needs. And the minute we start to look to our spouse for our ultimate fulfillment, we're going to be miserable. And, it was in my marriage personally, when I stopped laying all these heavy expectations on Gary as to what I thought he needed to be for me, and I began to really invite God to be my all in all and believe that he is sufficient for me, and that Gary, whatever Gary can offer is icing on the cake, but God is the cake. And if I can turn to him and with my needs, with my grief, with my disappointments, and trust that he has my best interest at heart, and maybe the very thing that is hard for me right now with my husband is the very way in which God wants to speak to me about me and what I need to address and how I need to grow. And that was sort of a life-changing thought for me, is maybe God's doing something in me when I've wanted him to do something in him. And when I started to turn the lens toward myself, and to know that my God loves me and wants to provide for me and has provided for me, that began to change my expectations and my demands into trust. And that's a whole different path.
Well, God takes us to a point where he doesn't want us to ask the question, how do I get out of this? As opposed to asking the question, what can I get out of this? And the lessons we need to learn.
Yeah, right.
When marital conflict comes and people talk about their hurt feelings, do you walk them through trying to identify not just that it hurt, but to look at the why it hurt? Whose voice are you actually hearing? Are you hearing the voice of your husband, or is that your dad or your coach or some other influence? And does it take you back to a place of discomfort? You go to the doctor and say, I've got a pain, and he pushes around, and when he finally hits that spot and you cry out, he always hits it again. The first time is to determine where it hurts, and the next time is to determine why it hurts. And this self-examination, I don't think we do enough of that. We are reactionary. We tend to be unforgiving. We don't afford the same latitude to our spouse as we do to a total stranger, and that becomes obvious to the offended spouse. You treat the clerk at the grocery store and you talk to her nicer than you talk to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think where our reactivity shows up in relationship with our spouse, we can pretty much guess that has a history. And I often, to answer your question, Eric, I often will take couples back into their family of origin work and what happened in their family of origin, to not to beat up parents and not to live in the past, but with the intention of helping them understand the wound of their childhood. I do believe that all of us have a wound. None of us leave childhood unscathed, not because we had bad parents, but there are no perfect parents.
Right.
And we all long for deeply. I've never met anybody who didn't long to feel unconditionally loved for exactly who they are, and to feel like they made a difference, that they have impact, that they are valued. And invariably, our parents, because they're not perfect, cannot do that completely for us. And when they can't, we have a wound. And that wound, what happens is we begin to develop these ways of protecting ourselves from the hurt and the pain of that. And often as kids, it's very unconscious what we do. We become pleasers because maybe we have a critical parent who withdrew from us if we didn't do things right, or punished us by either being critical or withdrawing. And so we learned very early that we needed to be good and we needed to please our parents, because that's the way we sustained that attachment to them. Or maybe we had parents that really didn't do feelings well and avoided feelings at all cost. And when you were hurt as a child, perhaps there was no comfort for you, and you weren't invited to talk about your feelings, and therefore you as an adult are quite cut off from your feelings. So when your wife comes to you and she wants to feel more emotionally close, you kind of freeze up and push her away and tell her she's needy, because that's not something you're comfortable with. And so we carry these things, I call them stowaways. We carry these wounds of childhood and the protectors that we developed to protect ourselves from any further pain. We carry those into our adulthood, and often it's not till we get into the intimate relationship of marriage that these stowaways kind of pop out of the hold, and we begin to see that we have these protective ways of relating to each other. And so that's something I unpack quite a bit in the book is how to identify those protective things we do and help us to rein in our reactivity so we can have different conversations.
You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the sovereignty of God, and God chose the families that we were in to develop in us certain giftings and certain attributes. I think of the photo album that people have in their homes of their children and of their parents and life, and there's nothing in there about grandma's favorite vase that got broken. There's never a photograph, and we don't hold on to these images, but we hold on to the memories. And so we have the ability to chart whatever we want to and harvest whatever we choose to from our childhood. But I couldn't do that at 25. I couldn't do that at 30. I can do that at 65 because you reach an age where you look back and say, you know what, I reject that. I reject what was spoken into me. I reject those kind of things, and they did the best they could with what they knew, but life was different then in this country than it was in the old country, and I can understand why they reacted that way, what they carried with them, but I'm not going to carry that with me. You know, young is impressionable, they're still working through identity, and it's not really that fully formed. So these young couples in their 20s are self-developing and then developing in a relationship, and that can be quite stressful while launching a career and a family.
You're totally right, Eric. It can be very stressful, and yet I've been amazed at the couples, the young couples that can come in and learn how to identify these protective ways of being, because the reactivity is so painful for them that they're motivated to find out why they react as they do. And as I guide them in the process, they're able to begin to see how their reactivity is really fueling the fire and triggering their mate. It's uncanny how one's triggers can then trigger the protectors of the other, and now they're in a full-blown, turmoil because they're just triggering each other. And so helping to identify, and that's what I do in the chapter 4, is helping them to identify the ways in which they protect themselves and the ways they react, and also guiding them into having compassion for that young part of them that was wounded. And as they're able to offer grace to that young part of them that was wounded, the mate can start to feel compassion toward the experience of the other. And ultimately, my hope is that they can become a place of comfort for one another and learn how to look at the other, not as a bad guy when things are going south, but as someone who has protectors that are jumping in, and when they can calm them, they can bring their abiding self back to the relationship, and things can go a different direction.
You make such a great point, because unless it's facilitated and there's a third party in the room, the conversation can very much be, why didn't you tell me this before? Why didn't you share that with me? Had I only known that this happened in your life, I might have made a different decision, or that might have changed the whole dynamic. And so having someone who's there that can minister to them, be a translator, be a facilitator, and a calming influence is incredibly important
It can be extremely helpful. Now, I don't think it's absolutely necessary, and that's why I try and coach people to do this in the book, but I do think it's very helpful, because oftentimes we're just blindsided about our own wound. We have a difficult time really seeing that young part of us that was wounded, and so it does help to have a third party do that. But I also think that people, if they can spend some time doing some self-awareness and working through some of those exercises, that they really can begin to get some insight into why they react as they do in conflict.
Has it been your observation that there seems to be, is it an increase in child molestation or women being molested, or is it just more of an openness to discuss it? Because I've found over the years that I'm shocked at how many and what the incidence is of this horrible behavior.
Yeah. I do a lot of trauma work myself, and so it is a really incredibly too frequent experience. I think they say 1 in 4 women have been raped, but the number, the amount of child abuse often goes unhidden because it's often in families, and there's this pledge of secrecy, or there's this intimidation that occurs, or a threat to cut off. And so, a lot of times it does not get disclosed. And that is so debilitating for the one who's keeping the secret, because nothing, what is hidden can't be healed, and what is brought into the light can be. And so I do, those who have been wounded and abused have tremendous courage to come forward and be able to process what happened to them. And I think it's really necessary for them to heal and become whole.
Is there a defined responsibility as to who's responsible for creating a safe environment? Is that a husband's role?
It's both their role, absolutely. It's not one person or the other. Whenever we get a choice, every moment that we react to our spouse, we have a choice of whether we're going to make it safe or not. Whether we are going to be critical and cause them to want to hide, or whether we're going to be gracious and open and inviting and compassionate and invite them to talk. And when we're aware of our own faults, when we're aware of our own sin, when we're aware that we stumble in many ways, we can have the humility to say, hey, I'm not a piece of cake to live with either, and I really need to hear my mate out on this. And, we all want to be heard, we all want to be understood, and we need to learn to offer that in order to receive that. And so I think, if a wife is critical, she's going to create a lack of safety. If a husband is withdrawing and disconnects when she needs connection, she's not going to feel safe. So I think it behooves both to think about, and I often encourage couples to ask your mate, what is it I say or do that causes you to feel unsafe when we're talking, or when we're trying to work through a conflict, or just generally? And ask your mate that question and be very open and receptive to the answer, because whatever that is gives you a clue of what you really need to do to create the intimacy you long for. And a lot of times there's been so much hurt that they have disconnected from the desire or longing to feel intimate. But that intimacy is what you're made for. And it does take some courage to be the first one to step in and say, you know what, I want to change this up. I want to make this safer so that we can feel like best friends and lovers and really make that happen for us. So I'm going to take a bold step here. And honey, I want to know, what do I do or say that makes you feel unsafe in sharing your real self with me? And that's a beginning conversation that can really lead to some fruitful changes.
Older couples I've seen, and oftentimes it's second marriage, a man will do everything he possibly can to win the heart, but he conquers, he's victorious, and once he has it, he doesn't do the things he needs to do to maintain the heart.
Yeah, he's gotten to the edge of the banquet table. He's taken a bite of a roll, and then he said, hey, I'm good. Really, there's this huge banquet to be had in terms of what God intends for that relationship. And people are content, and in this context from your story, he is content to just have a small nibble. And there is so much more to enjoy. And if he could learn, and I think, we were never promised marriage would be easy. And really, the whole process, the Bible's very clear that we're all in process. They call it sanctification. We're all in process of becoming someone new. We're all in the process of becoming more like Christ. And if you want to sign up for that, it has to do with your marriage as well. Let your marriage be that instrument of God to do the work in your life to mature you to become more like Him.
Are you finding young couples understand the concept of covenant?
Not so much, which is why I included it in the book. I think it's an old term. It sounds, Old Testament, and it sounds conventional. And so I try to convey it in some really relatable terms because it's such a beautiful concept. And what I love about the idea of covenant is that it really, when God made a covenant with whomever, Noah, Abraham, whomever, it was always unilateral. He moved toward them, and it wasn't contingent on anything now they did or said. It was everlasting covenant. And now, whether the person, if the person dishonored the covenant, and they wouldn't experience the blessing of covenant, but the covenant itself was unilateral. And I think, as I think about marriage, I think if you can have that attitude of unilateral love to the other, that's going to really help your marriage move, accelerate in its growth, if you can have that mentality. But it really is a beautiful thing to think there's nothing that's going to withdraw God's love from us. And He loves us so much that He gave us this institution, or this beautiful relationship of marriage, to help us know Him. You know, it even says in Ephesians that the relationship between husband and wife is like Christ and the church. There's a way in which we emulate, or we represent that very intimate, loving relationship. And so I think it's a very beautiful covenant. Is a very beautiful concept, which says, I will love you to the end. I will love you no matter what. I am there for you. I'm not going to withdraw my love from you. And it's a powerful thing, because I think why covenant, because today a lot of couples think, you know, divorce is very common, and a lot of people think, I want to keep my options open, you know, and if divorce is, you know, necessary, okay. And, you know, I think in some cases, you know, it does happen. But what I love about this idea of covenant is that it holds a couple together until things do get better. If you really commit to staying the course, it creates the safety. If there's always options, if there's always a 1 foot in and 1 foot out, there's never going to be enough safety to experience the intimacy that marriage was designed to provide. But if you are in covenant and you believe, my husband used to say, divorce never, murder yes, but divorce never. But of course he's kidding. But what he's saying is that we're not going there. And we've never uttered the D word in 42 years of marriage. And because we believe that God is in covenant with us, and we are in covenant with one another. I made my vow not to Gary. I made my vow to God.
Amen.
And secondarily to Gary. And Amen. So that covenant is what holds us together until we can experience the fruit of the investment.
You know, when they walk down the center aisle, they're making the last trip. And usually you have them walk down the center aisle and they're looking at their family, which is on one side. And they're basically saying, this is the last time you're going to see me. Right now I belong to you. And the bride walks down and she says that to the other side. When they come back, they're joined together. They pass through the cut. The same way that God passed through for Abraham to confirm His covenant with Abraham. And now they're saying, we don't belong to you, we belong to each other. And we're in a covenant relationship, and we're passing through to confirm our covenant with each other. This is why the center aisle, this is the whole history behind this biblical principle of passing through and confirming the covenant with each other. We've been talking with Laura Taggart, author of Making Love Last, Divorce-Proofing Your Young Marriage. If you have a young couple in your family, young couple in your church, and you want to give them the tools to make love last, if you want to give them the tools to make their marriage thrive instead of just survive, this is the book for you. I encourage you to visit the Books and Media page on ignitinginitiative.com and click on this and get a copy for yourself, maybe several of them to give out for the holiday season coming up. Laura Taggart, thank you so much for being with us here on Revealing the Truth.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, Eric. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.